liftoff and the clock has started. Yes, sir. Reading you loud and clear.
Roger, roll, Discovery.
Discovery, roger, go from them.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the May 13, 2020 edition of Space News. This is Peter Auld, and tonight I'm joined by Michael Abdullah and Angelo De Grazia, and we're all from the Space Association. So let's get the show started with some news from New Zealand. Rocket Lab hopes to soon resume launches from New Zealand. The company last week completed a wet dress rehearsal for its next Electron launch, carrying satellites for the US National Reconnaissance Office and other customers. The launch was scheduled for late March, but postponed when the New Zealand government imposed a strict lockdown to combat the coronavirus pandemic. The government has now eased the lockdown, and Rocket Lab said it plans to set a new launch date soon. And over to the US, the leadership of the US House Science Committee is asking the Government Accountability Office to investigate the management of the International Space Station US National Lab. The chair and ranking members of the full committee and its Space Subcommittee said the findings of an independent review of the Centre for the Advancement of Science in Space, or CASIS, the non-profit organisation that manages the National Lab for NASA, were deeply troubling. The review found problems with CASIS management and its interactions with NASA. The House Committee asked the GAO to review how CASIS makes use of ISS resources and selects research payloads, as well as whether NASA's responses to the recommendations of that independent review will be effective. And it's over to you, Michael.
Thank you, Peter. And let's turn to NASA's Commercial Crew Program. NASA and SpaceX are in the final phases of preparation for a commercial crew test flight scheduled for launch later this month. SpaceX conducted the last in a series of tests last week for the Crew Dragon parachute system, one of the final steps before the Demo 2 mission launch. NASA and company officials said they were preparing for a series of reviews in the next few weeks leading up to the May 27 launch. NASA astronauts Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley will have an extended stay on the International Space Station, the length of which will depend on the health of the Crew Dragon spacecraft docked to the station and the readiness of the next Crew Dragon spacecraft. Despite optimism about the status of Crew Dragon, NASA is proceeding with plans to buy a Soyuz seat from Roscosmos for an October mission, with a deal expected to be completed soon. And turning to NASA's Artemis moon program. NASA may launch the first two elements of the Lunar Gateway on a single rocket. Agency officials said they're considering launching the power and propulsion element and the habitation and logistics outpost modules together on a rocket like the Falcon Heavy, saying extended payload fairings under development by SpaceX for national security missions could make such a launch feasible. Original plans called for the two modules to be launched separately and dock autonomously in lunar orbit. NASA says the Gateway is key to its long-term sustainable lunar exploration plans, but may not use it for the first human lunar landing mission targeted for 2024. Meanwhile, NASA hopes to resume testing of the Space Launch System in the next few weeks. Work on the all-up green run static fire test of the first SLS core stage at the Stennis Space Center has been suspended since mid-March because of the coronavirus pandemic. That work will resume, albeit at a reduced pace, later this month. The first launch of SLS is now not expected until late next year. Leaders of the House Science Committee have criticised NASA's Lunar Lander Awards. In a statement last week, The chairs of the House Science Committee and its Space Subcommittee said they were troubled by NASA's plans to push ahead with the use of public and private partnerships in the Human Landing System program. They had backed a NASA authorization bill introduced earlier this year that called for a more traditional approach to lunar lander development, with the lander remaining government-owned. They also criticised NASA for failing to provide a detailed plan and cost estimate for the Artemis program. The chair of the Senate Commerce Committee, by contrast, praised the use of commercial partnerships in lunar lander development. Meanwhile, a NASA evaluation of the Human Landing System bids found that SpaceX's proposal offered the most capabilities but also the most risks. The source selection statement noted that SpaceX's Starship-based lander supported not just an initial 2024 landing, but also later sustainable phase missions. However, agency reviewers noted poor schedule performance by SpaceX on other programs and a high degree of complexity of the overall architecture, raising doubts about its ability to be ready by 2024. Reviewers offered higher scores to the other two winners, Blue Origin and Dynetics, but for both found weaknesses in their respective landers' propulsion systems that raised doubts about them being ready by 2024.
Okay, thanks Mike. Let's turn to US Space Force and things military. The next X-37B spaceplane mission will carry experiments for both NASA and the Defence Department. Air Force Secretary Barbara Barrett said the OTV-6 mission, scheduled for launch on May 16 on an Atlas V, will carry more experiments than any previous flight of the robotic spaceplane. The X-37B will include a service module attached to the back of the vehicle to host additional experiments. Among the experiments the Pentagon has disclosed for the mission are NASA payloads to study the effects of space radiation on materials, and one by the Naval Research Lab to convert solar power into microwave energy that is beamed down to Earth. Let's move across the ocean to Russia. Russian company Energia has lost a contract to build a replacement communications satellite for Angola to another Russian company. Energia built the Angosat-1 satellite, which malfunctioned shortly after launch in late 2017. Energia was originally expected to build a replacement satellite, Angosat-2, but the company disclosed that the satellite will instead be built by Reshetnev Information Satellite Systems Company, which has built other communications satellite as well as navigation satellites. The change in manufacturers, Energia said in financial documents, was made at the request of the customer. And the Energia executive diagnosed with COVID-19 has passed away. As reported previously on Space News, Yevgeny Mikrin, chief designer for Energia, was diagnosed with the disease last month, shortly after attending a Soyuz launch of 3 people to the International Space Station. Roscosmos last week said he died, but did not state the cause of death. Before Mikrin's death, 173 people in the Russian space industry had been diagnosed with the disease and 6 had died. Across to China. A next-generation Chinese crewed spacecraft landed last week after a nearly 3-day test flight. The spacecraft launched without a crew on the Long March 5B from the Wenchang Satellite Launch Center, re-entered and landed in the desert Dongfeng landing area. The spacecraft performed several maneuvers during the mission, raising the apogee of its orbit to about 8,000 kilometres in order to test a high-speed re-entry similar to a return from a mission beyond Earth orbit. But Chinese media reported that the spacecraft's flexible and inflatable cargo return capsule had operated abnormally during its re-entry. The capsule tested an inflatable heat shield that could be used for future spacecraft returning cargo from China's space station or for other applications. While a fully functional version of the spacecraft can support missions to deep space, China's crewed lunar plans are vague, with such missions potentially taking place in the mid-2030s. The successful launch allows China to proceed with the development of a space station whose modules will be launched on the Long March 5B booster. The station's core module, Tianhe, is expected to launch in early 2021. As reported last week on Space News, the launch also cleared the way for a Long March 5 launch this July of the Tianwen-1 Mars mission. Okay, back to the United States and talk SpaceX. A prototype of SpaceX's Starship vehicle performed a static fire test last week. The Spaceship SN4 vehicle fired its single Raptor engine for about 4 seconds at SpaceX's South Texas facility. The test firing was the first for a Starship prototype since tests of the smaller Starhopper vehicle last year and came after 3 previous Starship prototypes were destroyed in pressurization tests. SpaceX is expected to attempt a short free flight of this prototype to an altitude of 150 metres in the coming weeks. Keeping on with commercial to Aerojet Rocketdyne. Aerojet Rocketdyne says a new contract for RS-25 engines for NASA's Space Launch System will enable it to lower the engine's cost. The company received a contract recently for a further 18 RS-25 engines valued at $1.79 billion. The company is not disclosing the per-engine cost, but says that it is less than $100 million per engine, one might calculate from the total value of the contract, since that contract also includes testing, overheads and other costs. Aerojet expects to reduce the RS-25 engine's cost by 30% over the contract's life through the use of additive manufacturing or 3D printing and revised manufacturing practices. NASA has received some criticism over the RS-25 engines, as the formerly reusable Space Shuttle engines will be flown a single time on the SLS rocket and then dropped into the ocean.
Thank you, Angelo. And staying with commercial space news and Virgin Galactic and Virgin Orbit. Virgin Galactic's Spaceship Two made its first flight last week from New Mexico's Spaceport America. The unpowered glide flight by the vehicle, named VSS Unity, allowed the company to compare its performance to similar unpowered flights and gave the flight team experience operating from the spaceport. The test was the first flight of the vehicle since February 2019, which carried a third crew member, Virgin Galactic's Beth Moses, in the passenger cabin for the first time. Virgin said last year it expected to begin commercial operations from the spaceport this northern summer, but earlier this year backed away from that schedule, stating that its goal was to fly company founder Richard Branson to space before the end of the year. And Virgin Orbit hopes to carry out the first launch of its Launcher 1 rocket later this month. The company completed a captive carry test flight of the air launch system last month and, more recently, a wet dress rehearsal of ground operations, some of the final steps before being ready for the flight. The launch itself won't be live-streamed, the company said, because it added a level of complexity that it wanted to avoid for the first flight. The company has also signed an agreement to perform Launcher 1 launches from a US Air Force base in Guam. And finally tonight, NASA is working with Tom Cruise on a film at the International Space Station, although it's not clear if that involves the actor actually going to space. A report last week claimed Cruise was working with both SpaceX and NASA to shoot an action-adventure movie on the station. In a tweet, NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine said that NASA was excited to work with Cruise on a film aboard the space station. That statement, though, could also be interpreted to mean that Cruise was involved in a film project and not necessarily that Cruise himself would go to the station. NASA declined to provide additional details, and the original report noted that the proposal was still early in development with no studio attached. Well, that's all we have time for tonight. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Angelo, and we will speak to you again next week. Good night.